Pistons have played 46 regular season games this year in the National Basketball Association. They currently stand at 11 wins on the season, the second worst record in the NBA, only behind the Orlando Magic, also in the Eastern Conference. Just finished up a Western Conference road trip, which they won 1 out of their 4 games. That game, of course, against the Sacramento Kings. To talk about the state of the Pistons at this time, also as we approach the trade deadline and rumors already flowing around the Detroit Pistons, particularly around Jeremy Grant. We're joined now, once again, by Lauren Williams, Pistons Beat Writer at mlive.com. Lauren, thank you for being back with us.
Thank you for having me.
Appreciate having you on. So, obviously the record for the Pistons is disappointing. You're looking to see a little bit of improvement in the team from the previous year in the record books, but it's a very similar state that this Pistons squad is currently in to a year ago. Developing their young guys, they're going to lose a lot of these games. Kind of bring in these vets to keep them somewhat competitive and to help them develop these younger guys and develop some of the and obtain some of these assets that can potentially bring in pieces later on down the road. But particularly, the recent games have been quite the struggle. Part of that's because they're playing very competitive teams from the Western Conference, but particularly in these last 5 games and really over this 4-game Western road trip. What's your assessment of where this Pistons team is at this point in the season?
Honestly, I think where they are right now is kind of where a lot of people expected them to be. Obviously, they added Cade Cunningham at the beginning of the season via the draft, but Troy Weaver kind of warned us ahead of time that he didn't expect him to be kind of the savior of the franchise. He was kind of just, the second step after he had that successful draft class last year. The issue with the Pistons right now is that the team is very, very young. They don't have a lot of veterans around them to kind of help build them up and put them in a position of success like they did last year. They don't have Derrick Rose. They don't have Blake Griffin. They don't have DeLon Wright. So a lot of those veterans were, as well as Mason Plumlee, I can't believe I forgot him. Yeah. But they don't have those veterans who were a big part of what kept them competitive in games last season. I mean, yes, they lost a lot, but the difference was they were competitive. I think now that we've kind of turned the page to the new year, we're kind of starting to see that competitive, spunky team that people expected them to be at the beginning of the season. They've had wins over the reigning champs, the Milwaukee Bucks, at the beginning of the month. Yeah. They had wins over the Utah Jazz, where they came back from a 22-point deficit. And obviously, both the Jazz and the Bucks are teams that are going to be contending for the championship. So the fact that the Pistons were able to go ahead and have pretty decisive wins over those teams, I think it's a good start for what people should expect going forward.
And so you talk about some of the impact of some of those veterans that obviously last year played a key role on the Pistons team and them being competitive but still losing a lot of these games as was expected. This year a little bit of the injury bug has had an impact, certainly in the front court. Kelly Olynyk has been injured on and off this season, just came back from a knee injury before that Western Conference trip and played pretty well, but he's also gone through other health protocols. How significant is that injury, both for Kelly and his play and for the Pistons going forward this season, especially with most of their depth being in those wing positions or at the guard position?
I mean, I think you can look at that Sacramento Kings game and you can already pinpoint the kind of impact that Kelly Olynyk is going to have on this team. He's going to space the floor. He's a stabilizing presence. He is able to get inside the paint, drive through contact, get points on the board. So I think, you can already see the impact that he already had. I mean, in those first 10 games, he was already a stabilizing presence off of the bench. So he's very invaluable to this team. And, you can expect that they're going to have a lot of value for him going forward once he clears, the health and safety protocols. Obviously, that was kind of a lick of bad luck right there, coming back from the knee injury, then entering protocols almost, shortly after. But I think once he's back, people are going to really see how big of an impact he has, not just in terms of spacing the floor, but just from a mental standpoint with a lot of those rookies and second-year players.
Yeah, Kelly Olynyk been a key player for the Pistons, veteran, but still a relatively young veteran too. That could be around for a while, barring any sort of a trade at the trade deadline. Although I wouldn't imagine, unless they're bringing in a significant piece in return for someone like him and for Jeremy Grant, that he would be involved in that. But let's talk at that point about Jeremy Grant. The trade deadline's coming up in a couple of weeks. This year it's on February 10th. Obviously, Jeremy Grant's somebody that a lot of teams are coveting, particularly contenders looking to add that one more piece that is at a relatively affordable salary, but can provide great production for that team. We've already heard some rumors about the Philadelphia 76ers engaging their interests. We've heard more recently that the Los Angeles Lakers allegedly had made an offer for Jeremy Grant. At this point in time, from your conversations with the Pistons front office, with their coaching staff, how much of an interest is there in the Pistons organization to explore potentially moving Jeremy Grant, given where he is in his contract with the team, the production that he's having, and the potential haul that could come back and help to catapult this rebuild?
I think one thing that's kind of stuck out to me, especially following last year's trade deadline, Troy Weaver said no player is untouchable. So right now, Jeremy is commanding probably the most value that he might have in his stint with the Pistons. Right now, it seems as though they're just kind of entertaining offers. There isn't anything that's kind of stuck out to them. And I think a lot of the chatter that we've heard has been just that. It's been chatter. If there was a viable option out there, you better believe that Troy Weaver probably would have pulled the trigger and made the deal. You saw that he did that with Rodney Magruder and the Bobo trade. Of course, that one fell through, during Bobo's physical, but he's not afraid to make the right decision when the time comes. And if a team comes with an offer that he deems is worthy of Jeremy's value, then I'm sure he would go ahead and make that deal.
Yeah, Jeremy Grant currently making $20 million. Next year, he'll make just a little bit shy of $21 million. So he has another year on his contract. That's a plus for a team that's looking to bring him in and contend this year, but also have the potential to have that depth next year if they're going to be contending for a while and they want to have those extra pieces or add some strength to their lineup. But certainly, if they're going to be moving Jeremy Grant, they'll be looking for a draft pick, particularly or preferably a relatively high draft pick that's at or near lottery level, and if not, and maybe some young pieces too. Probably, they're going to have to get to cover the salary cap in those trades. But if you're the Pistons in that perspective, if you're moving Jeremy Grant, a guy that's been so key to this team, and is still relatively young and still has a lot of basketball to play ahead of him, could be really a huge part of this rebuild. If he does stick around, there's got to be a big haul that's coming back, and the Pistons, I think, would be content to keep him on that team unless they're getting something back that is significant. But for these contending teams, a lot of them, they don't have that additional depth to be able to provide, particularly those young players or those draft picks that are going to be really enticing enough for the Pistons. So for a contender that's looking to pick up Jeremy Grant, a Philadelphia team, a team like the Los Angeles Lakers or other teams that we've heard rumored to be interested in Jeremy at this time, what do you believe it would take for the Pistons to be truly interested and engage in those offers, or maybe even pull the trigger on a Jeremy Grant trade?
I mean, I think you kind of touched on it already. It would have to be a pick that would bring them back some significant return down the line. I mean, it's a huge gamble to say move on from Jeremy Grant, as you said, who's, been incredibly efficient for them thus far this season. Obviously, he's been out with injuries so far. But in terms of them getting something back, it would definitely have to be something in the first round, as well as likely some, as you said, up and coming young players who can, fill out the roster in Jeremy's place.
Yeah, Jeremy Grant had a career year with the Pistons last year. This year, 20 points per game. His current average, shooting 41% from the field, 33% from three. Also higher on his averages for the majority of his career. We're joined by Lauren Williams, Pistons Beat Writer at MLive.com, joining us on the Megacast. As you mentioned earlier, despite the Pistons' struggles, we're seeing some really great play of late, especially from first overall pick and rookie Cade Cunningham, who, as you've said, Dwayne Casey, head coach of the Pistons, has said doesn't see as the savior of this team. It's not the kind of guy that you're going to bring in year one, where he has the potential to be a generational talent, but he's not one of those guys that's coming in and is immediately that generational talent that takes a team that's one of the 3 worst in the league record-wise a year ago and catapults them into a playoff team or into a contending team. That being said, despite the injuries early on in the season and his struggles early on in the season, he's really coming into his own. 16 points a game, roughly 40% from the field, not turning the ball over that much, averaging about 4 per game. From what the Pistons are seeing right now, how satisfied are they with Cade Cunningham's pretty rapid development into a significant leader on this team as they're looking to the future, and how does that impact where they plan going forward in this rebuild?
I think they're incredibly happy with how fast Cade has progressed in terms of developing. I think one of the biggest things that they want to see him cut down on is those turnovers. I mean, 4 turnovers per game, it's not the worst in the league, especially considering he is a young ball handler. And you look at guys like Trae Young and James Harden, and they have higher turnover rates than he does. But, when you have a team that as a whole is averaging about 15 turnovers per game, you kind of want your young ball handler to kind of be a little bit more secure with that. On Sunday night, he had 6 turnovers, and, that's kind of part of what lost them the ball game there. Just because even though it was Kojo and Sadiq at the end of that game who really highlighted how bad the Pistons' lack of ball security has been, they want that guy who's their leader to be a little bit safer, a little bit smarter with the decisions that he makes when he's driving into the paint or the passes that he's making. But overall, I think the Pistons, because they're in a restoration point, they don't really have the luxury of, being a little too picky with where they go next. I think when it comes to the draft, they're going to pick the best player available wherever they land.
Yeah, and right now, second worst record in the league behind the Orlando Magic. Certainly, they're going to be in the draft lottery when all is said and done. Where how high or middle or low in that draft lottery that they're going to be will be determined by the second half of the season. But regardless, they're going to get a high-level talent or be able to be in a position for one in this draft. And they got a lot of questions that they'll be able to answer because of the depth of this draft and because of the depth of their needs. They're pretty satisfied, of course, they're satisfied with Cade Cunningham. Beef Stew's had a consistently satisfying performance over this year. It was great in his rookie season as well. Sadiq Bey continues to make massive improvements, and so for them, it's looking really in the future. Like those next big questions they need to answer are what additional front court help can we provide to put that second guy next to Isaiah Stewart, or in the backcourt. With the current turnover issues with Cade Cunningham lately, and with his style of play, is he our shooting guard? Is he our point guard of the future? And certainly, Killian Hayes is going to play a big factor into there. He came off the bench against Denver, seemed to play pretty well. Do you think that may be something that the Pistons explore more in the future, is having Killian Hayes not so much be that point guard of the future or that shooting guard of the future, but be that key player, that key young player off the bench that really is the anchor of that second unit?
I think it very much, as you said, depends on what the second half of the season brings. Right now, one of the things that they've really wanted to see Killian hone in on is being a little bit more aggressive with getting to the paint. He's a 6'5" guard, and there are a lot of smaller guards in the league that he can go up against. I mean, he can take advantage of some of the mismatches in the paint with the bigs just because of his size, and he would probably get the favorable call if he tried to attack the rim. So I think they want to see him be a little bit more aggressive in his scoring, not necessarily shooting, but his scoring. I also think he did, as you said, really, really well coming off of the bench, and that might be the best solution for him. I know in the past, Dwayne Casey has said that one of the things that he thought was a disservice was putting Killian as a starting point guard at the beginning of last season. And, with each passing game, I think it's becoming more and more clear that maybe he is better suited coming off of the bench. So I think it'll depend on what happens in the second half of the season. I think they really like the three guard lineup, and they liked what they saw with Cade, Killian, and Corey Joseph playing together. I know Dwayne Casey's a big fan of that because it just creates a lot more opportunity for the ball to move more freely. So I think it'll just depend on what rotations, what lineups work best.
And so, Lauren, we're joined by Lauren Williams, Pistons Beat Writer at mlive.com. You can learn more by going to mlive.com/Pistons and read all of Lauren's articles and follow along with the Pistons as they continue through this season and through this rebuild. All implications that we've spoken about, the draft, the remainder of the season, the continued development of these young guys. Pistons continue to be in this rebuild. They got that core mostly in place, barring the next players they'll bring in, presumably through the draft and what happens with potentially Jeremy Grant if he is on the move as well. But in taking that next step in the rebuild, there's a point in every rebuild, in the NBA certainly, but in really all sports, where the front office hits the gas and they go full throttle at it, and they really try to make that team take a big step forward and try to contend. Where along the lines is this Pistons rebuild right now before we hit that point? Are we approaching that? Could this summer be that point with the cap space that they have, with the young assets that they have, with a potential high lottery pick coming in once again? Or are we still a year or two away, in your eyes, from the Pistons being at the point where they're ready to go full throttle at this?
In my opinion, I think that the year 4 of the rebuild will be kind of when they go full throttle. I think, they're still going to take their swings in free agency this season, this off season, just to kind of see what's out there, what they can get, and how it fits with the timeline that they're trying to reach the championships. I think because they have another lottery pick coming up, it's going to be really important for next season to be that development year for that lottery pick. Obviously, Cade and, the 2020 draft picks will have a lot more experience under their belts, so that should aid in the development of that pick faster. So I think year 4 is kind of when you're going to see them put the foot on the gas. I mean, that's just my opinion based on the pace that we've kind of seen Troy Weaver move and how he's made his move. I mean, he kind of ripped everything out from the studs last offseason. So it's going to take some time, especially when you look at teams like the Suns, who, it took them a couple of lottery picks before they've kind of started to contend again. You look at the Bucks and how long it took them before they were in contention. You look at the 76ers and how long it took them before, how many number 1 picks it took before they started competing in the playoffs. So I think, there are a lot of teams around the league that you can kind of look at as a blueprint in terms of how long the Pistons potentially see this rebuild going. But in my opinion, I think year 4 is when we're going to see them start to put their foot on the gas. I think if a trade with Jeremy Grant does end up happening before the deadline or at the deadline this year, I think that does signal kind of where Troy Weaver's head is in terms of the direction that he wants to go. So I think that's kind of the start of the turning point, but not quite the full turning point, if that makes any sense.
It does, and so it'll be very interesting as we approach February 10th. That's kind of that next checkpoint where we'll see where this direction with the Pistons continues to be pointing. Generally going in the same direction, and it's clear where they're going, but trade deadline, the Jeremy Grant situation, going to be critical to that. Then the next step would be the draft and the offseason. Lauren, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.